The old farmhouse crouched at the end of the long dirt road, like a beast waiting to prey. John shivered as he guided his truck toward the looming structure, emerging from the oak trees that enclosed the property in shadow. He knew he was being silly, superstitious even. But after 3 months on the road, traveling for work, he was eager to get back home, settle into his own bed, and sleep without the constant rumble of his truck's engine underneath. As he pulled up in front of the house, John surveyed the peeling paint and sagging porch with dismay. The place was really starting to show its age after 2 long years without anyone living there full time. "I'll have to put in some real work this weekend," he muttered to himself as he climbed out of the truck, grabbing his overnight bag from the passenger seat. The deepening twilight pressed in around him as he strode to the front door, fishing his keys out of his jeans pocket. His boots crunched on the gravel walkway. John shivered again as a chill wind whipped around the corner of the house, rustling dry leaves across the porch boards. Why did he suddenly feel like he was being watched? He shook his head to dismiss such foolish thoughts and fitted the key in the lock with a twist, throwing the heavy door open with a creak. Darkness yawned inside. John fumbled on the wall for the light switch but paused when his fingers found only empty space. Damn, of course the power would be out. His grandfather had always been too stubborn and tight-fisted to spring for a generator when storms knocked the lines down. Groping in his bag for his flashlight, John clicked it on and swept the beam across the foyer. Dust motes swirled in the light, and a musty smell rose from the wooden floors, familiar yet somehow unsettling in the pitch-dark interior. As he made his way deeper into the house, he picked out shapes in the flashlight's glow. The grandfather clock by the stairs, embroidered samplers hanging crooked on the walls, his grandmother's china cabinet full of trinkets in the parlor. John walked from room to room, checking for signs of disturbance or intrusion, but everything seemed just as he remembered leaving it. His room upstairs was dusty but undisturbed. He shone the flashlight out the window, but the woods surrounding the property were too dense. He couldn't see more than a few feet into the blackness between the trees. Setting his bag down on the squeaky bed springs, John decided to do a full property check before turning in for the night. He clicked off the flashlight to conserve batteries and felt his way downstairs and out the back door, grabbing the heavy chain and padlock to secure it behind him. The dark seemed thicker out here, enveloping him like a black fog. John took a deep breath of the chilly midnight air and started his loop around the perimeter, sticking close to the house where he could feel the rough wood, siding, and windows to guide his way. A snap echoed behind him, and John whirled with a pounding heart, playing his light across the yard. Nothing but shadows meeting his gaze. He chuckled shakily, feeling foolish again. Probably just a branch breaking under its own weight in the woods. Trying to shake off his jitters, John rounded the corner of the house. Another noise made him freeze, this time low and feral, coming from right beside him in the darkness. The hairs stood up all over his body. He flung the flashlight beam toward the source of the sound and staggered back with a yell. 2 pinpricks of reflected light stared back at him from the edge of the forest, too low to the ground, framing a muzzle full of sharp teeth, bared in a snarl. But it wasn't an animal. Those eyes were too intelligent, too full of malevolence. And as John stared in mute horror, the creature seemed to smile, if you could call the pull of muscle and skin over bone a smile. It took a noiseless step forward, and John turned and ran, sprinting for the back door with reckless abandon. His hand shook so badly, it took 3 tries to find the lock and undo it, flinging himself inside and rebolting it behind him, all while those terrible eyes bored into his back the whole way. Leaning against the sturdy oak, panting for breath, John listened for any sounds beyond the door. Only the sigh of the wind answered him now. Had it followed? Was it still out there, waiting, watching? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. There was something unnatural, something wrong about this place, and he was no longer alone in the dark. John's heart was pounding as he took step by step and stood with his back against the kitchen door, flashlight beam piercing the inky yard outside, but revealing nothing amiss. What had he seen out there? Some rabid animal crazed by the night, or something far more sinister? Shaking off his paralysis, John pushed away from the door on unsteady legs. He had to arm himself, had to make the house secure against whatever lurked beyond. In the knife block by the sink, his hands closed around the handle of his grandfather's old hunting knife, heavy and reassuring in his grip. With a knife tucked in his belt, John did a sweep of the ground floor, locking every window and drawing what few curtains they had. Back in the parlor, a shape in the darkness had him raising the knife, but it was only his own reflection, peering back from the dark glass of a framed photo. Heart still racing, John peered closer. Something was wrong with the picture. His grandfather and grandmother stood smiling as always on the porch, but over his grandpa's shoulder peered a gaunt face, darkness seeming to pool in its sunken eye sockets. John reeled back with a gasp, almost dropping the flashlight. The reflection was wrong, strangely distorted, or was something else in the room with him? Wheeling around, knife held high, John's light swept the shadowy corners. At first glance, all seemed as it should be. But as he turned to go, movement in his peripheral made him swing back. There, behind the grandfather clock, a low shape detached itself from the darkness, rising up on 2 legs to tower over him. John screamed and flung the knife without thinking. It sank home with a wet thud, followed by an unearthly shriek that chilled him to his core. The creature came at him with unnatural speed, emerging fully into the moonlight that slanted through cracks in the boarded windows. Gangly and hairless, with limbs that bent the wrong way, and a gash of a mouth full of blade-like teeth. This was no animal. As John scrambled backward in horror, his foot caught on the edge of an oriental rug. Off balance, he fell, and the thing was on him, pouncing with corpse-pale limbs, outstretched, horrible gurgling sounds emanating from its ruined throat. Above it all, John's own screams rent the air, and then there was only blackness. Consciousness slowly returned to John in fits and starts. At first, there was only pain, a pounding in his head, aching all over. Then cold seeped in, biting at his skin through his thin shirt. He tried to move, to rub some warmth back into his limbs, but found his wrists restrained above his head. Panic jolted him fully awake. John's eyes flew open to darkness everywhere, disoriented. As his vision adjusted, jagged stones swam into focus around him, the low ceiling above scraping the tops of his shoulders. A dank smell assaulted his nostrils. He was in the cellar. Memories rushed back. The creature in the house. The struggle. It must have overpowered him and dragged him down here. But for what purpose? Stealing his nerve, John craned his neck, listening. Faint scuttling sounds echoed distantly. Then, a low moan drifted out of the blackness, raising the hairs on his neck. He wasn't alone down in this pit. As his eyes adjusted further, Ghostly shapes began to emerge, huddled against the far wall. John stifled a cry. Pale, emaciated forms littered the floor, some motionless, some rocking and keening piteously. Prisoners like him. A scraping noise spun him around as much as his bonds allowed. 2 pinpricks of light regarded him from the dark, and the creature emerged, gaunt and gangly as before. It cocked its head, bony smile stretching impossibly wide, and clicked its blade-like teeth together slowly. John's blood ran cold. Whatever hellish plans it had for him and these poor souls, the game had only just begun. The creature circled John slowly, rasping breaths like death rattles in the close air of the cellar. John's wrists ached in their bonds, but he didn't dare pull against them, not with that maw full of knife teeth so near. As it leaned in to sniff curiously at his neck, John caught a glimpse of movement behind it. One of the huddled shapes was sitting up, eyes wide and fixed on John with an intense gleam. Something metallic glinted faintly in its clasped hands. Distracted by its prey, the creature didn't notice as the figure stood unsteadily. It crept forward on tattered bare feet, raising its hand. A loose manacle swung from one thin wrist, and it was this it gripped like a weapon. John met its eye and nodded fractionally. With a hoarse cry, the captive flung itself onto the creature's back, swinging the manacle with wild abandon. It screamed, raw and inhuman, as the iron bit into the back of its neck. John kicked out with both feet, connecting with its ankle joints. There was a crack, and it came crashing down. Scrambling, John twisted behind it and slammed his bound hands down on the ragged spine with all his strength. Another crack, and it went limp. Panting, John sagged back against the wall as his savior knelt shakily. With fingers like claws, it picked at the knots, binding John's wrists till they fell away. "Thank you," John breathed. Its answering grin was feral, yet held triumph. As one, they turned to the huddled prisoners, and the long fight to free them began. Survival was what mattered now. With the creature lying dead in a broken heap, John felt the first stirrings of hope return. But their situation was still dire down in the cursed cellar. He turned to his savior, who was now working to free the other captives. Up close, John could see its emaciated frame, patches of lank hair, and sunken eyes, yet a flickering spark of humanity remained. "Thank you for your help. I'm John," he said gently. It nodded in acknowledgement, but did not speak. Once the last manacles were removed, John addressed them all. "My friends, we've overpowered our captor, but the hardest part is still ahead. Escape. Does anyone know how long they've been down here? Or a way out?" Weak murmurs and shaken heads met his question. Despair threatened again, but John steeled himself. "Then we searched the walls. There must be a door, or tunnel, or something." As the others scattered to feel along the cold stones, John's rescuer gripped his arm with startling strength. It pointed to the corner, where a rusted metal ring was set in the dirt floor. Together they scraped and dug until a trapdoor emerged, straining on ancient hinges. Light poured down, the blessed light of the rising moon, and with it, a rush of dank, forest-scented air. John heaved the door open fully and beheld a tunnel leading up. Renewed cries of hope broke out among the survivors. John turned to them with a smile. "Our way out lies above. Come, my friends. Freedom awaits." As John helped haul the frail survivors up through the tunnel one by one, he was filled with renewed determination. The awful ordeal in the cellar was behind them, at last. Emerging into the moonlit clearing by the farmhouse, John took a deep breath of the crisp night air. It had never smelled so sweet. But their escape was not complete. They had to get away from this cursed place. John turned to address the ragged group huddled together. "My friends, stay close as we make for the woods. There we can hide until help arrives." They set off towards the dense trees, John and his rescuer helping to support the weakest. As they entered the forest, shadows swallowed them whole. John swept the ground with his flashlight, praying no roots or holes would trip them up. A snapped twig had them all freezing in terror. But it was only a small animal, darting away unharmed. They pressed on, putting distance between themselves and that horrid farmhouse with every labored step. Dawn was lightening the sky by the time they stumbled into a small clearing. Exhausted, they collapsed among the fallen leaves. As his charge slept fitfully, John kept watch, scanning the woods for any signs they were being pursued. For now all seemed calm, but the ordeal was far from over, and the secrets of that terrible place still needed unraveling. John swore he would not rest until he uncovered the truth. As the morning sun rose higher, it brought no warmth, only an ominous heaviness to the air. Dark clouds were massing on the horizon. John shook the survivors awake. "A storm is coming. We must find shelter." Helping the weakest to their feet, John looked to his rescuer. "Which way from here?" It studied the sky intently, then pointed northeast. They trekked on through the thickening forest as the wind began to howl. Just as the first fat raindrops fell, a strange structure loomed ahead, an old half-collapsed hunting blind. John peered within, dry, if confined. "In here, hurry!" They crammed into the small shelter, moments before the downpour hit with a roar. Thunder boomed overhead as lightning lit the sky. Safe for now, but soaked and exhausted. As the storm raged, John took stock of their dire needs. Food, water, warm clothes, and blankets. Trying to form a plan, he turned to his rescuer. "You've saved us twice now. I never got your name." It hesitated as if unsure itself, then croaked, "Sarah." John smiled. "Well, Sarah, when this passes we'll find what we need to survive. I promise you, we will make it out of this alive." Sarah's eyes shone with newfound hope. As night fell and the storm continued to lash the woods, for the first time they had reason to believe dawn might bring salvation. The storm dragged on through the night, an endless barrage of wind and rain against the rickety shelter. John held vigil, as best he could, conserving the flashlight batteries. The others slept fitfully, shivering in their tattered rags. Sarah tended the weakest, draping her thin form over theirs in an effort to share warmth. John watched the strange bond form between this fierce survivor and her charges. It stirred something in him, a reminder of their shared humanity, despite all they'd endured. As dawn light filtered through cracks in the worn panels, John roused the others gently. Rain still fell, but the storm had passed its peak. "We must find food and supplies. Sarah, will you lead us?" She nodded, rising on unsteady legs. They set out single file behind her through the sodden forest. After some time, Sarah halted and pointed. A ramshackle abandoned hunt camp stood ahead, surrounded by overgrown gardens gone feral. "Let's search for anything useful. Be wary. This place could hide dangers." They found old stores untouched by time. Canned goods, blankets, tools. A small victory, but one that might make the difference between life and death. As they returned to the others with their haul, John felt the first glimmers of optimism. With solidarity and Sarah's guidance, survival was achievable, despite the evil that still lurked in these woods. Under Sarah's watchful eye, John organized the survivors at their camp. He set some to repairs on their ramshackle shelter, while others sorted supplies or kept a lookout. Rummaging the food stores, John's hopes rose further. Then a cry rose from the watch. "Strangers approaching!" All froze in fear, but as two haggard figures emerged from the trees, John felt only pity. More souls fleeing that cursed place. He called out gently, offering aid. They collapsed in gratitude, telling a harrowing tale. They had escaped the farm just that morning. But more unsettling was their description of the ones left behind. John nodded solemnly. "We've all seen terrible things, but for now you're safe. Rest and regain your strength." That evening, as a light rain fell again, John gazed into the fire with Sarah. "Our numbers grow, but so do the challenges. Winter is coming. We must find more permanent shelter soon." Sarah nodded sagely. "I may know a place, if we can reach it, but the forest hides many eyes, and that house still stands." John laid a hand on her shoulder resolutely. "Have faith, my friend. We will make it through this together." But as night fell, and the survivors slept, unseen eyes did pierce the dark once more. John could only pray they remained unnoticed, and that dawn would not bring fresh horrors with the rising sun. Dawn broke cold and gray over the survivors' camp. As John stirred the remnants of the fire, his eyes met Sarah's across the ashes. Something was amiss. Rousing the others with care, they counted heads. 2 were missing. John turned to the latest arrivals, questioningly. "We were on watch together," the man stammered, wringing his hands. "There was a noise, and when I looked away for a moment..." Fear gripped John's heart. Had their camp been infiltrated right under their noses? Before panic could set in, Sarah spoke calmly. "We must find them before..." She didn't need to finish. Taking the strongest men, John and Sarah tracked prints leading into the wood. The trail grew increasingly erratic, then ceased altogether. John punched a tree in anguish. Then Sarah cried out. She had found a scrap of cloth snagged on branches. Fresh blood stained it. A howl split the air, chillingly close. John drew his hunting knife as figures emerged through the trees, but it was only the missing survivors, fleeing in terror. One collapsed, choking out final words. "It comes. We couldn't. So hungry." Then went still. The woods fell silent as death. John gathered the broken man gently. They had been so close to safety, and now their enemy had struck from the shadows once more. A heavy gloom hung over the survivors' camp in the aftermath of the attack. They buried their lost companion silently, reciting a hurried prayer for his soul. As the others retreated to grieve, John gathered the strongest men. "We can't stay vulnerable like this. It's time to put an end to whatever haunts these woods." But as they ventured into the misty forest, cracks formed in John's resolve. The trees seemed to press in, muffling sound, obscuring sight. An unseen watcher peered from every shadow. John shook his head to clear it. Just as he turned to suggest retreating, a sharp crack split the air. They spun to see one of their party sprint back towards camp, pursued by a loping, spectral figure. Drawing his hunting knife, John gave chase alongside the others, but the woods were a labyrinth. No matter which way they turned, the trail vanished. Days passed with no sign of their missing man. Tensions rose in the camp, despair setting in. John paced like a caged animal, racked with guilt. Then, by chance, he spotted movement through the foliage, a pale, familiar figure moving with purpose through the trees. Sarah had found the trail. With renewed hope, John rallied the men to follow. This time, they would end their tormentor once and for all, or die trying. The woods fell away as Sarah led them with steely determination. John knew she must have suffered horrors here to develop such tracking skills. Finally, they broke through into a mist-shrouded clearing, and there, atop a crumbling stone outcrop, a spectral figure raked icy eyes over them. To John's shock, it spoke, in a rasp like dead leaves. "You encroach where you are not wanted, mortal filth. All who enter my domain will meet their end." Gripping his knife, John stepped forward boldly. "No more will you prey on innocent souls. Release our friend and trouble us no further." It threw back its head and emitted a high, keening wail that chilled them to the bone. When it lowered its face again, its features had shifted into a mask of nightmarish malice. As it leapt gracefully to the clearing floor, the men brandished weapons unsurely. But Sarah strode ahead of them all, unafraid, meeting its gaze dead on. It snarled softly, "The stray returns. I should have snapped your neck long ago." Sarah only smiled grimly, and in a flash, she threw something small and gleaming through the air, her last hidden dagger burying itself in its shoulder. As Sarah's dagger found its mark, the creature let out an anguished howl that shook the trees. Its eyes blazed with rage and pain as it turned on Sarah, claws extended. But she was ready, ducking low and coming up swiping with her hunting knife. It sliced a long gash across its torso. Greenish blood spilled down its pale form. John didn't wait to see more. With a yell, he barreled into its side, both of them tumbling to the damp earth. The creature writhed and kicked, impossibly strong. Its long nails raked John's arm, drawing screams of pain. The men swarmed in, wielding hatchets and knives, landing kicks and punches wherever they could. It flung them off like leaves, fangs bared in a feral snarl. John smashed the jagged stone again and again into its twisted face until it was a pulpy mass. Sarah clung to its back, hacking and sawing at its stringy neck muscles with grim determination. Dark blood spurted as her blade bit deeper. With an unearthly howl, it reared up on warped legs, trying to buck her off. The others recovered and renewed their attack. A hatchet sank into its knee, severing tendons. It collapsed, flailing madly as they rained blows upon its shrieking form. At last, with a guttural gurgle, the light faded from its bulging eyes. The woods fell silent, but for their gasping breaths. John crawled to Sarah's side, both surveying the ruin of their long enemy with cold satisfaction. In the clearing stillness, John and Sarah looked around at the other survivors, with relief and pride. They had prevailed against the evil that haunted these woods. Weak rays of sun filtering through the mist showed the full gore of the victory. Sinking to his knees, John marveled that they had found the strength. Sarah knelt beside him and squeezed his arm gently, a proud smile lingering on her scarred face. Together, they led the men back through the woods, following Sarah's unerring tracking. At last they emerged into their camp, bearing grim news and weary bodies. But with their foe defeated, a brighter future seemed possible at last. As the survivors tended wounds and buried their fallen friend properly, John vowed to rebuild this broken community. Over the next few years, they transformed the ruined hunting camp into a permanent settlement surrounded by thriving fields. Sarah stayed by John's side, becoming trusted advisor and protector to all. Though scars of the past never fully healed, in time the creeping menace of the forest receded from their hearts and minds. As for John, in the peace and simplicity he found with his people, he no longer yearned for his past life. This harsh land had become home, and these survivors his true family. And he knew as long as Sarah walked beside him, they would withstand any trials yet to come.